Okay, so we're here to talk about man against God, and what I'm reading from is the Orthodox Word. It's numbers 172 through 3. It was released in 1993, and it's writing from Eugene Seraphim Rose. So let's see. This is the editor's preface. It says, in a basement apartment near downtown San Francisco in the early 1960s, Eugene Rose, the future Father Seraphim, sat at his desk, covered with stacks of books and piles of paper folders. The room was perpetually dark, for little light could come in from the window. Some years before, Eugene had moved there. A murder had occurred in that room, and some said that an ominous spirit still lingered there. But Eugene, as if in defiance of this spirit and the ever darkening spirit of the city around him, had one wall covered with icons, before which a red icon lamp always flickered. In this room, Eugene undertook to write a monumental chronicle of modern man's war against God, and his attempt to destroy the old order and raise up a new one without Christ, to deny the existence of the kingdom of God and raise up his own earthly utopia in its stead. This project work was entitled The Kingdom of Man and the Kingdom of God. Only a few years before this, Eugene himself had been ensnared in the kingdom of man and had suffered in it. He too had been at war against God, having rejected the Protestant Christianity of his formative years as being weak and ineffectual. He'd taken part in the Bohemian counterculture in the 1950s, and had delved into Eastern religions and philosophies which taught that God is ultimately impersonal, like the absurdist artists and writers of his day. He experimented with insanity, breaking down logical thought processes as a way of breaking on over to the other side. He read the words of the mad prophet of nihilism, Friedrich Nietzsche, until the words resonated in his soul with an electric, infernal power. Through all these means, he was seeking to obtain to truth, or reality, with his mind, but they all resulted in failure. He was reduced to such a state of despair that when later asked to describe it, he would only say, I was in hell. He would get drunk and would grapple with God, whom he had claimed was dead, pounding on the floor and screaming at him to leave him alone. Once in a while, intoxicated, he wrote, quote, I am sick, as all men are sick. Are sick who are absent from the love of God. Atheism, Eugene wrote in later years, true existential atheism, burning with a hatred of a seemingly unjust or unmerciful God, is a spiritual state. It is a real attempt to grapple with the true God, whose ways are so inexplicable even to the most believing of men, and has more than once been known to end in a blinding vision of him whom the real atheist truly seeks. It is Christ who works in these souls. The Antichrist is not to be found primarily in the great deniers, but in the small affirmers, whose Christ is only on the lips. Nietzsche, in calling himself Antichrist, proved thereby his intense hunger for Christ. It was in such a condition of intense hunger that Eugene found himself in the late 1950s, and then, like a sudden gust of wind, there entered into his life a reality they had never have foreseen. Towards the end of his life, he recalled this moment. Quote, for years in my studies, I was satisfied with being above all traditions, but somehow faithful to them. When I visited an Orthodox church, it was only in order to view another tradition. However, when I entered into an Orthodox church for the first time, a Russian church in San Francisco, something happened to me. had not experienced in any Buddhist or other Eastern temples. Something in my heart said that this was home, that all my search was over. I didn't really know what this meant because the service was quite strange to me and in a foreign language. I began to attend Orthodox services more frequently, gradually learning its language and customs. With my exposure to Orthodoxy and to Orthodox people, a new idea began to enter into my awareness. That truth was not just an abstract idea sought and known by the mind, but it was something personal, even a person sought and loved by the heart. And that is how I met Christ. While working on the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God in his basement apartment, Eugene was still coming to grips with what he had found. He had come upon the truth and the undistorted image of Christ, as preserved in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but he yearned to enter into what he called the heart of hearts of that church, its mystical dimension, not its boring, worldly, organizational aspect. He wanted God and wanted him passionately. His writings from this time were kind of a catharsis for him, a means of emerging out of untruth, out of the underground darkness and into light. Although they are psychological in tone, philosophical in tone, much more so than his later works, these earlier writings were born of an intense suffering that was still very fresh in his soul. It was only natural that he would write much more about the kingdom of man, in which he had suffered all his life, than about the kingdom of God, which he had yet only caught a glimpse. It was still through the prism of the kingdom of man that he viewed the kingdom of God. Of the 14 chapters Eugene planned to write for his magnum opus, see the outline that follows, only the seventh was typed in complete form. The rest remained in handwritten notes. This seventh chapter, which we present below, was the philosophy of nihilism. Nihilism, the belief that there is no absolute truth, that all truth is relative, is Eugene inferred, the basic philosophy of the 20th century has become, in our time, so widespread and pervasive, have entered so thoroughly and so deeply into the minds and hearts of men living today, that there's no longer any front on which it may be fought. The heart of this philosophy, he said, was, quote, expressed most clearly by Nietzsche and by a character of Dostoevsky in the phrase, quote, God is dead, therefore man becomes God and everything is possible. From his own experience, Eugene believed that modern man cannot come to Christ fully until he is first aware of how far he is and his society has fallen away from him. That is, until he first faced the nihilism in himself. The nihilism of our age exists in all, he wrote, quote, and those who do not, with the aid of God, choose to combat it in the name of the fullness of being of the living God, are swallowed up already. We've been brought to the edge of the abyss of nothingness, and whether we recognize its nature or not, we will, through affinity for the ever present nothingness within us, be engulfed in it beyond all the hope of redemption. Unless we cling in full and certain faith, which doubting does not doubt, to Christ with whom we are truly nothing. As a writer, Eugene felt he must call his contemporaries back from the abyss. He wrote not only of his own desire for God, but out of his concern for others who desired him also. Even those, as he himself had once done, rejected God, who warred against him, out of their very desire for him. Out of his pain of heart, out of the darkness of his former life, Eugene speaks to contemporary humanity and finds himself in the same pain and darkness. Now, 3 decades since he wrote this work, as the power of nihilism and anti Christianity enter more deeply into the fiber of our society, his words are more needed than ever. Having faced and fought against the nihilism in himself, he is able to help us prevent us from being captured by its soul destroying spirit and help us to cling to Christ, the eternal truth, become flesh. So, this is the subject we're on today. I hope everybody's all right. Appreciate everybody. Judeo Christianity. You're in the wrong place, my friend. But stick around. Okay, one introduction, the question of truth. What is nihilism, in which we have seen the root of the revolution of the modern age? The answer at first thought does not seem difficult. Several obvious examples of it spring immediate to mind. There's Hitler's fantastic program of destruction, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Dadaist attack on art. There's the background from which these movements sprang, most notably represented by several, quote, possessed individuals of the late 19th century. Poets like Rimbaud and Baudelaire, revolutionaries like Buchanan and Nietzsche, or Nakiev, I think that's how you say it. Prophets like, it's in quotes, prophets like Nietzsche. There's on a humbler level among our contemporaries the vague unrest that leads some to flock to magicians like Hitler and others to find escape in drugs or false religions or to perpetuate those senseless crimes that become more and more characteristic of these times. But these represent no more than the spectacular surface of the problem of nihilism. To account even for these, once one probes beneath the surface, is by no means an easy task. But by the task we have set for ourselves in this chapter is broader. To understand the nature of the whole movement, which these phenomena are but extreme examples. To do this, it will be necessary to avoid two great pitfalls lying on either side of the path we have chosen. And to one or the other, which are most commentators on the nihilist spirit of the age have fallen, apology and diatribe. Anyone aware of the two obvious imperfections of the evil modern civilization have been the more immediate occasion and cause of the nihilist reaction, though we shall see that these two have been the fruit of an incipient nihilism, cannot be but fill a measure of sympathy which some at least of the men who have participated in that reaction. Some sympathy may take form of pity for men who may, from one point of view, be an innocent, quote, victim of conditions against which their efforts have been directed, or again, it may be expressed in the common opinion that certain types of nihilist phenomenon have actually, quote, positive significance and have a role to play in some, quote, new development of history or of man. The later attitude, again, is in itself one of the more obvious fruits of the very nihilism in question here. But the former attitude, at least, is not entirely devoid of truth or justice. For that very reason, however, we must all the most be careful not to give it undue importance. It is all too easy in the atmosphere and intellectual fog that pervades liberal and humanist circles today to allow sympathy for an unfortunate person to pass over into receptivity to its ideas. The nihilist, to be sure, is in some sense, quote, sick, and his sickness is a testimony to the sickness of an age whose best as well as worst elements turn nihilism. But sickness is not cured, not even properly diagnosed by, quote, sympathy. In any case, there is no such thing as an entirely innocent victim. The nihilist is all too obviously involved in the very sins and guilt of mankind that produce the evils of our age, and in taking arms, as do all nihilists, not only against real or imagined, quote, abuses and, quote, injustices in the social and religious order, the nihilist takes an active part in the work of Satan, for such it is, that can by no means be explained away by the mythology of, quote, innocent victim. No one in the last analysis serves Satan against his will. But if, quote, apology is far from our intention in these pages, neither in our aim or mere diatribe, it is not sufficient, for example, to condemn Nazism or Bolshevism for their barbarism, gangsterism, or anti-intellectualism, and the artistic or literary avant-garde for their pessimism or exhibitionism, nor is it enough to defend the democracies in the name of civilization, progress, or humanism, or for their advocacy of, quote, private property or, quote, civil liberties. Such arguments, while some of them possess a certain justice, are really quite beside the point. The blows of nihilism strike too deep. Its program is far too radical to be effectually countered by them. Nihilism has error for its root, and error can be conquered only by truth. Most of the criticism of nihilism is not directed to this root at all. And the reason for this, as we shall see, is that nihilism has begun in our time so widespread and pervasive, has entered so thoroughly and so deeply into the minds and hearts of all men living today, that there is no longer any quote front on which it may be fought. And those who think they are fighting it are most often using its own weapons, which they in effect turn against themselves. Some will perhaps object, once they have seen the scope of our project, that we have set our net too wide, that we have exaggerated the prevalence of nihilism, or if not, then that the phenomenon is so universal as to defy handling at all. We must admit that our task is an ambitious one, all the more so because of the ambiguity of many nihilist phenomenon. And indeed, if we were to attempt a thorough examination of the question of our work would never end. It is possible, however, to set aside a net and still catch the fish we are after, because it is, after all, a single fish, a large one. A complete documentation of nihilist phenomenon is out of the question, but an examination of the inquirer nihilist mentality that underlies them, and of its indisputable effects and its role in contemporary history is surely possible. We shall attempt here first to describe this mentality, and several at least of its most important manifestations, and offer a sketch of historical developments, then to probe more deeply into its meaning and historical program. But before this we can be done, we must know more clearly of what we are speaking. We must begin, therefore, with a definition of nihilism. This task need not to detain us long. Nihilism has been defined, and quite succinctly, but the fond of philosophical nihilism, Nietzsche, quote, that there is no truth, that there is no absolute state of affairs, no thing in itself. That this alone is nihilism, and of the most extreme kind. There is no truth. Quote, we have not we have encountered this phrase already more than once in this book, and it will recur frequently hereafter. For the question of nihilism is profoundly a question of truth. It is indeed the question of truth. But what is truth? The question is, first of all, one of logic. Because we discuss the content of truth, we must examine its very probability and the conditions of its postulation, and by, quote, truth, we mean, of course, as Nietzsche's denial of it makes explicit, absolute truth, which we have already defined, and the dimensions of the beginning of the end of things. Quote, absolute truth. The phrase has to a generation raised on skepticism and unaccustomed to serious thought and antiquated ring. No one surely is the common idea. No one is naive enough to believe in, quote, absolute truth. Any more, all truth to our enlightened age is, quote, relative. The latter expression, let us note, quote, all truth is relative, is the popular translation of Nietzsche's phrase, quote, there is no absolute truth. The one doctrine is the foundation of nihilism alike of the masses and of the elite. Quote, the relative truth is primarily represented for our age by the knowledge of science, being its which begins in observation, proceeds by logic, and progresses in orderly fashion from known to the unknown. It is always discursive, contingent, qualified, always expressed in, quote, relation to something else, never standing alone, never categorical, never absolute. The unrealistic scientific specialist sees no need for any other kind of knowledge occupied with the demands of his speciality. He has perhaps neither time nor inclination for, quote, abstract questions that inquire, for example, into the basic presuppositions of the speciality If he is pressed, or if his mind spontaneously turns to such questions, the most obvious explanation is usually sufficient to satisfy his curiosity. All truth is empirical, all truth is relative. Either the statement, of course, is a self contradiction. The first statement is not in itself not empirical at all, but metaphysical. The second itself is an absolute statement. The question of absolute truth is raised first of all for the critical observer by such contradictions, and the first logical conclusion which he must be led is this: if there is any truth at all, it cannot be merely, quote, relative. The first principle of modern science, as is any system of knowledge, are themselves unchangeable and absolute. If they were not, there would be no knowledge at all, not even the most, quote, reflective knowledge, for there would be no criteria by which to classify anything as knowledge or truth. This axiom has a corollary. The absolute cannot be attained by means of the relative. That is to say, the first principle of any system of knowledge cannot be arrived through the means of that knowledge itself, but must be given in advance. They are the object not of scientific demonstration, but of faith. We have discussed in an earlier chapter that the universality of faith seeing as an underlying all human activity and knowledge. We have seen that faith, if it is not to fall prey to subjective illusions, must be rooted in truth. It is therefore a legitimate, indeed unavoidable question whether the first principles of the scientific faith, for example, the coherence and formality of nature, the transsubjectivity of human knowledge, the adequacy of reason to draw conclusions from observations, are founded in absolute truth. If they are not, they can be no more than unverifiable possibilities, or probabilities rather. The pragmatic position taken by many scientists and humanists who cannot be troubled to think about ultimate things, the position that these principles are no more than an experimental hypothesis, which collective experience finds reliable. It's surely unsatisfactory. It may offer a psychological explanation of the faith these principles inspire. But since it does not establish the foundation of that faith and truth, it leaves the whole scientific edifice on shifting sands and provides no sure defense against the irrational winds that periodically attack it. In actual fact, however, whether it be from simple naivety or from a deeper insight which they cannot justify by argument, most scientists and humanists undoubtedly believe their faith has something to do with the truth of things. Whether this belief is justified or not, of course, is another question. It is not a metaphysical question, and one thing that is certain is that it is not justified by the rather primitive metaphysics of the most scientists. Every man, as we have seen, lives by faith. Likewise, every man, something less obvious but no less certain, is a metaphysician. Metaphysician. The claim to any knowledge whatever, and no living man can refrain from this claim, implies a theory and a standard of knowledge, and a notion of what it is ultimately knowable in truth. This ultimate truth, whether it is to be conceived as the Christian God or simply the ultimate coherence of things, it is a metaphysical first principle and an absolute truth. But with the acknowledgement, logically unavoidable, of such a principle, the theory of the, quote, relative truth collapses in itself, being revealed as a self contradictory absolute. The proclamation of the, quote, relativity of truth is thus what might be called a, quote, negative metaphysics, but a metaphysics all the same. There are several principal forms of, quote, negative metaphysics, and since each contradicts itself in a slightly different way and appeals to a slightly different mentality, it would be wise to devote a paragraph here to the examination of each. We may divide them into two categories of, quote, realism and, quote, agnosticism, each of which in turn may be subdivided into naive and critical. Naive realism, or naturalism, does not precisely deny absolute truth, but rather makes absolute claims of its own that cannot be defended, rejecting any, quote, ideal or, quote, spiritual absolute. It claims the absolute truth of, quote, materialism and, quote, determinationism. This philosophy is still current in some circles. It is official Marxist doctrine and is expounded by some unsophisticated scientific thinkers in the West, but the main current of contemporary thought has left it behind. And it seems today the quaint relic of a simpler but bygone day, the Victorian day when many transferred to science, the allegiance and emotions that had been devoted to religion. It is impossible to formulation of a scientific metaphysics. Impossible because science is by its nature knowledge of the particular, and metaphysics is knowledge of what underlies the particular and is presupposed by it. It is a suicidal philosophy in that, quote, materialism and determinism it posits render all philosophy invalid, since it must insist that philosophy, like everything else, is, quote, determined. It advocates its advocates can only claim that their philosophy, since it exists, is inevitable, but not at all it is true. This philosophy, in fact, if consistent, would do away with the category of truth altogether by its adherents, innocent of thought that either contradiction may be seen or a less abstract level as the altruistic and idealistic practice of, for example, the Russian nihilists of last century, a practice in flagrant contradiction of their purely materialistic and egocentric theology. Vladimir uh, Solovyov, I believe I don't know how to say it, clearly pointed out this discrepancy by ascribing to them the Syllogians. Wait. Syllogism. Quote, man is descended from a monkey, and consequently we shall love one another. All philosophy presupposes to some degree the autonomy of the ideas. Philosophical, quote, materialism is thus a species of, quote, idealism. It is, one might say, the self confusion of those whose ideas do not rise above the obvious, whose thirst for truth is so easily um, assuaged. So words I don't know, by science that they make it into their absolute. Quote, critical realism or positivism is the straightforward denial of metaphysical truth, proceeding from the same scientific predispositions as more naive naturalism. It professes greater modesty in abandoning the absolute truth altogether and restricting itself to, quote, empirical, quote, relative truth. We already noted the contradiction in this position. The denial of absolute truth is in itself an absolute truth. Again, as with naturalism, the very posting of the first principle of positivism is itself its own refutation. I get what it's saying, man. That's pretty wild. So I need to go do something real quick. I'm going away just for a moment. Appreciate anybody that's watching. And what I'm going to do is this, and if you've seen any of my videos before, this is what I do when I go for a minute. So I'm going to put on this. I'll be right back. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. All right. Okay. Back. Forgive me. Sorry, guys. Take this banner down. All right. So, let's see. All right. Only in critical or pure agnosticism do we find at last what seems to be successful renunciation of the absolute. Unfortunately, such renunciation entails the renunciation of everything else and ends, if it is consistent, in total solipsism. Such agnosticism is the simple statement of fact. We do not know whether there exists an absolute truth or what its nature could be if it did exist. Let us then, this is the corollary. What? I gotta look up this word. What does this word mean? I gotta figure out this word real quick. I'm sorry, guys. Interested. Yeah. Where's that? Where's it? Corollary. A proposition that follows from and is often appended to one already proven, forming a proposition that follows from already proven. See how that's a corollary. Okay. All right, I got it. So I said it right earlier, but it's just one of those words. Corollary. Content ourselves with the empirical relative truth we can know. What is truth? What is knowledge? If there is no absolute standard by which these are to be measured, they cannot even be defined. The agnostic, if he acknowledges this criticism, does not allow it to disturb him. His position is one of pragmatism, experimentalism, and instrumentalism. There is no truth, but man can survive. Can you get along in the world without it? Such a position has been defended in high places and in very low places as well. In other anti-intellectualist century, but the least one can say of it is that it is intellectually irresponsible. It is the definitive abandonment of truth, or rather, the surrender of truth to power, whether that power be nation, race, class, comfort, or whatever cause is able to absorb the energies men once devoted to the truth. The pragmatist and the quote agnostic may be quite sincere and well-meaning, but they only deceive themselves and others if they continue to use the word truth to describe what they are seeking. Their existence, in fact, is testimony to the fact that the search for truth, which has so long animated European man, has come to an end. 4 centuries and more of modern thought have been, from one point of view, an experiment in the possibilities of knowledge open to man. Assuming that there is no, quote, revealed truth, the conclusion which Hume already saw, and from which he fled into the comfort of, quote, common sense, and conventional life in which the multitude sense today without possessing any such secure refuge. The conclusion of this experiment is an absolute negation. If there is no revealed truth, there is no truth at all. The search for truth outside of revelation has come to a dead end. The scientist admits this by restricting himself to the narrowest specialities. Content, if he sees a certain coherence in a limited aggregate of facts without troubling himself over the existence of any truth, large or small. The multitudes demonstrate it by looking to the scientist, not for truth, but for the technological applications of knowledge, which has no more than a practical value, and by looking to the other irrational sources for the ultimate values men once expressed to find in truth. The despotism of science over practical life and contemporaneous with the advent of a whole series of pseudo-religious revelations. The two are correlative symptoms of the same malady, the abandonment of truth. Logic, thus, can take us this far. Denial of doubts or absolute truth leads, if one is consistent and honest, to the abyss of solipsism and irrationalism. The only position that involves no logical uh, contradictions is the affirmation of an absolute truth which underlies and secures lesser truths. And this absolute truth can be attained by no relative human means. At this point, logic fails us, and we must enter an entirely different universe of discourse if we are to proceed. It is one thing to state that there is no logical barrier to the affirmation of absolute truth. It is quite another actually to affirm it. Such an affirmation can be based upon only one source. The question of truth must come to an end in the question of revelation. Uh, Modern view. Wait. Skip. All right. The critical mind hesitates at this point. Must we seek from without what we cannot obtain by our own unaided power? It is a blow to pride, most of all to that pride which praises today for scientific humility, that sits down before the fact as a little child, and yet refuses to acknowledge any arbiter of fact save the proud human reason. It is, however, a particular revelation, divine revelation, the Christian revelation, that so repels the rationalist. Other revelations he does not gainsay. Indeed, the man who does not accept fully and consciously a coherent doctrine of truth, such as the Christian revelation provides, is forced, if he has any pretensions to knowledge whatever, to seek such a doctrine elsewhere. This has been the path of modern philosophy, which has ended in obscurity and confusion, because it would never squarely face the fact that it cannot supply for itself what can only be given from without. The blindness and confusion of modern philosophers with regard to first principles and the dimensions of the absolute have been the direct consequence of their own primary assumption, the non-existence of revelation. For this assumption, in effect, blinded men to the light of the sun and rendered obscure everything that once been clear in the light. To one who gropes in this darkness, there is but one path. If he will not be healed of his blindness, and that is to seek some light amidst the darkness here below, many run to the flickering candle of, quote, common sense. Uh, hmm. In conventional life, and accept because one must get along somehow. The current opinions of the social and intellectual circles to which they belong, but many others, finding this light too dim, flock, if nothing else, distracting. They become devotees of this or the other political or religious or artistic current that the quote spirit of the age has thrown into fashion. In fact, no one lives but by the light of some revelation, be it a true or a false one, whether it serve to enlighten or obscure. He who will not live by the Christian revelation must live by a false revelation, and all false revelations lead to the abyss. We began this investigation with the logical question, quote, what is truth? That question may and must be framed from an entirely different point of view. The skeptic Pilate asked the question, though not in earnest, ironically for him, he asked it of truth himself. Quote, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. Quote, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Truth in this sense, truth that confers eternal life and freedom, cannot be obtained by any human means. It can only be revealed from above by one who has the power to do so. The path to this truth is a narrow one, and most men, because they travel the quote broad path, miss it. There is no man, however, for so that God, who is truth, created him, who does not seek this truth. We shall examine in later chapters many of the false absolutes, the false gods men have invented the false gods men have invented and worshipped in our idolatrous age. We shall find that what is perhaps most striking about them is that every one of them, far from being any new quote revelation, is a dilution, a distortion, a perversion, or a parody of the one truth men cannot help but point to even in their error and blasphemy and pride. The notion of divine revelation has been thoroughly discredited for those who must obey the dictates of the quote, spirit of the age. But is it impossible to extinguish the thirst for truth which God has implanted in man to lead them to him, and which can only be satisfied the acceptance of his revelation? Even those who profess satisfaction with quote relative truths and consider themselves too sophisticated or honest or even quote humble to pursue the absolute, even they tire eventually of the fate of unsatisfactory tidbits to which they have arbitrarily confined themselves and long for more substantiated fare. The whole food of Christian truth, however, is accessible only to faith, and the chief obstacle to such faith is not logic, as the um, modern view has it, but another and opposed faith. We've seen indeed that logic cannot deny absolute truth without denying itself. The logic that sets itself up against the Christian revelation is merely the servant of a quote another revelation of a false, quote, absolute truth, namely nihilism. In the following pages, we shall categorize as nihilists men of, as it seems, widely divergent views, humanists, skeptics, revolutionaries of all hues, artists, philosophers, various schools, but they are united in a common task. Whether it positivist, quote, criticism of Christian truths and institutions, revolutionary violence against the old order, apocalyptic visions of universal destruction in the advent of a paradise on earth, or the objective scientific labors in the interest of, quote, better life in this world, the tacit assumptions being that there is no other world. Their aim is the same, the annihilation of divine revelation and the preparation of a new order in which there shall be no trace of old, uh, in which man shall be the only God there is. Chapter 2. The stages of the nihilistic dialectic. The nihilist mentality in the unity of its underlying aim is single, but this mentality manifests itself in phenomena as diverse as the natures of men who share it. The single nihilist cause is thus advanced on many fronts simultaneously, and its enemies are confused and deceived by this effective tactic. To the careful observer, however, the nihilist phenomenon reduce themselves to three or four principal types, and these few types are further related to each as stages in a process which may be called the nihilist dialectic. One stage of nihilism opposes itself to another, not to combat it effectively, but to incorporate its errors into its own program and carry mankind one step further on the road to the abyss that lies in the end of all nihilism. The arguments at stage, to be sure, are often effective in pointing out certain obvious deficiencies of a succeeding stage, but no criticism is ever radical enough to touch on the common errors of all stages share, and the partial truths which are admitted present in all forms of nihilism are in the end only tactic to seduce men to the great falsehood that underlies them all. The stages to be described in the following pages are not to be understood as merely chronological, though in the narrowest sense. They are in fact a kind of chronicle of the development of the nihilist mentality from the time of the failure of the nihilist experiment of the French Revolution to the rise of the latest and most explicitly nihilist manifestations of the revolution. National Socialism. Thus, the 2 decades before and two after the middle of the 19th century may be seen as the summit of liberal prestige and influence, and J.S. Mill as the typical liberal. The age of realism occupies perhaps the last half of the century and is exemplified on one hand by socialist thinkers and on the other by philosophers and popularizers, we should perhaps say rather exploiters of science. Vitalism in the forms of symbolism, occultism, artistic expressionism, and various evolutionary and quote mystical philosophies is the most significant intellectual undercurrent throughout the half century after 1875. And the nihilist century brings to a grand conclusion in the public order as well as many private spheres the whole century and a quarter of nihilist development with the concentrated area of destruction of 1914 to 45. It will be noticed that these periods overlap, for nihilism matures at a different rate in different people and in different individuals. The overlapping is in fact more extreme than our simple scheme can suggest, so much so that representatives of every stage can be found in every period, and all of them exist contemporaneously even today. It is true of historical periods, it is also true of individuals. There is no such thing as, quote, pure nihilist at any stage. Every predominantly nihilist temperament being a combination of at least two of the stages. Further, if the age since the French Revolution is the first one, in which nihilism has played the central role, each of its stages have been represented in earlier centuries. Liberalism, for example, is a direct derivative of Renaissance humanism. Realism was an important aspect of the Protestant Reformation, as well as the French Enlightenment. A kind of vitalism appeared in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, occultism, and again in Romanticism and the nihilism of destruction. While never so thorough as it has been for the past century, has existed as a temptation for certain extremist thinkers throughout the modern age. With these reservations, however, our scheme may perhaps be accepted, at least as an approximation to what has been undeniable historical and psychological process. Let us then begin our investigation of the stages of this process. The nihilist dialectic, attempting to judge them by the clear light of the orthodox Christian truth, which, if we are correct, they exist to obscure and deny. In this section, we attempt no more than to describe these stages and to point out by reference the definition of nihilism we have adopted and in what respect they may be characterized as nihilist. 1. Liberalism. The liberalism we shall describe in the following pages is not, let us state at the outset, an overt nihilism. It is rather a passive nihilism, or better yet, the neutral breeding ground of the more advanced stages of nihilism. Those who have followed our earlier discussion concerning the impossibility of spiritual or intellectual neutrality in this world will understand immediately why we have classified as nihilist a point of view which, while not directly responsible for any striking nihilist phenomenon, has been an indispensable prerequisite for their appearance. The incompetent defense by liberalism of a heritage in which it has never fully believed has been one of the most potent causes of overt nihilism. The liberal humanist civilization, which is Western Europe, was the last form of the old order that was effectively destroyed in the Great War and the revolutions of the second decade of this century, and which continues to exist, though in even more attenuated, quote, democratic form. And the free world today may be practically characterized by its attitude to truth. This is not an attitude of open hostility, nor even of deliberate unconcern, for its sincere apologists undeniably have genuine regard for what they consider to be truth. Rather, it is an attitude in which truth, despite certain appearances, no longer occupies the center of attention. Truth in which it professes to believe, apart, of course, from scientific fact. It is for it no spiritual or intellectual coincidence. Uh, wait. Uh, Intellectual coin of current circulation, but idle and fruitful capital left over from a previous age. The liberal still speaks, at least on a formal occasion, of, quote, eternal varieties, of, quote, faith, of, quote, human dignity, of man's, quote, high calling, or his, quote, unquenchable spirit, even of, quote, Christian civilization. But it is quite clear that these words no longer mean what they once meant. No liberal takes them with entire seriousness. They are, in fact, metaphors, ornaments of language that are meant to invoke an emotional, not an intellectual response. A response largely conditioned by long usage with the attendant memory of a time when such words actually had a positive and serious meaning. No one today who prides himself on his, quote, sophistication, that is to say, the very few in academic institutions, in government, in science, in humanist intellectual circles, no one who wishes to profess to a breast, what is that? Okay, breast of the time, quote, times does or can fully believe in absolute truth, or more particularly in Christian truth. Yet the name of truth has been retained, as has been the names of those truths men once regarded as absolute, and few in any position of authority or influence would hesitate to use them, even when they are aware that their meanings have changed. Truth in a word has been, quote, reinterpreted. The old forms have been emptied and given a new quasi-nihilist content. This may easily be seen by such brief examinations of several of the principal areas in which truth has been, quote, reinterpreted. And the theological order, the first truth, of course, God, omnipotent and omnipresent, creator of all, revealed to faith and in the experience of the faithful, and not contradicted by the reason of those who do not deny faith. God is the supreme and end all of creation, and himself, unlike creation, finds his end in himself. Everything created stands in relation to the dependence upon him, who alone depends upon nothing outside himself. He has created the world that it might live in enjoyment of him, and everything in the world is orientated towards this end, which, however, men may miss by misuse of their freedom. The modern mentality cannot tolerate such a God. He is both too intimate, quote, too personal, and even to human, and too absolute, too uncompromising in his demands of us, and he makes himself known only to the humble faith, a fact bound to alienate the proud modern intelligence. A new God is clearly required by modern man, a God more closely fashioned after the pattern of such central modern concerns as science and business. It has, in fact, been an important intention of modern thought to provide such a God. This intention is clear already in Descartes. It is brought to fruition in the deism of enlightenment, developed to its end in German idealism. The new God is not a being but an idea, not revealed to faith and humility, but constructed by the proud mind that still feels the need for, quote, explanation, when it has lost its desire for salvation. This is the dead god of philosophers who requires only, quote, first cause to complete their systems as well as their, quote, positive thinkers. And other religious sophists invent a god because they, quote, need him and then think to, quote, use him at will. Whether, quote, deists, idealists, pantheists, or uh, immanentist, I'm not sure. All the modern gods are the same mental construct fabricated by souls dead from the loss of faith in the true God. The atheist arguments against such a God are as irrefutable as they are irrelevant. For such a God is, in fact, the same as no God at all, uninterested in man, powerless to act in the world except to inspire a worldly quote, optimism. He is a God considerably weaker than men who invent him. On such a foundation, needless to say, nothing secure can be built, and it is with good reason that liberals, while usually professing belief in this deity, actually build their world view upon the more obvious, though hardly more stable foundation of man. Nihilist atheism is the explicit formulation of what already, not merely implicit, but actually present, is a confused form in liberalism. The ethical implications of belief in such a God are precisely the same as those of atheism. This inner agreement, however, is again disguised as outward behind a cloud of metaphor. In the Christian order, all activity in this life is viewed and judged in the light of the life of the future world, the life beyond death, which will have no end. The young believer can have no idea of what this life means to the believing Christian. For most people today, the future life has, like God, become a mere idea, and has therefore cost us little pain and effort to deny it or affirm it. For the believing Christian, the future life is joy inconceivable, joy surpassing the joy he knows in this life through communion with God in prayer, in the liturgy, in the sacraments, because then God will be all in all, and there will be no falling away from this joy, which will indeed be indefinitely enhanced. The true believer has the consolation of a foretaste of eternal life. The believer in the modern God, having no such foretaste and hence no notion of Christian joy, cannot believe in the future life in the same way. Indeed, if he were honest with himself, he would have to admit that he cannot believe in it at all. There are two primary forms of such disbelief which passes for liberal belief: the Protestant and the humanist. The liberal Protestant view of the future life, shared regrettably by increasing numbers who profess to be Catholic or even Orthodox, is like its view on everything else pertaining to the spiritual world. At a minimal profession of faith that masks an actual faith in nothing. The future life has become a shadowy underworld in a popular conception of it, a place to wake one's quote deserved rest after a life of toil. Nobody has a very clear idea of this realm, for it corresponds to no reality. It is rather an emotional projection, a consolation for those who would rather not face the implications of their actual disbelief. Such a quote heaven is the fruit of a union of Christian terminology with the ordinary worldliness. It is convincing to no one who realizes that compromise in such ultimate matters is impossible. Neither the true Orthodox Christian nor the consistent nihilist is seduced by it. But the compromise of humanism is, if anything, even less convincing. Here there is scarcely even the pretense of that the idea corresponds to reality. All becomes metaphor and rhetoric. The humanist no longer speaks of heaven at all, at least not seriously, but he does not allow himself to speak of the quote eternal, preferably in the form of a resounding figure of speech, quote eternal varieties, quote eternal spirit of man. One may justly question whether the word has any meaning at all in such phrases. In human stoicism, the quote eternal has been reduced to a constant so thin and frail as to be virtually indistinguishable from the materialist or and determinist nihilism that attempts, with such justification, surely to destroy it. In either case, in that the liberal quote Christian or even more liberal humanist, the inability to believe in eternal life is rooted in the same fact. They believe only in this world. They have neither experience nor knowledge of nor faith in the other world. And most of all, they believe in quote a God who is not powerful enough to raise men from the dead. Behind their rhetoric, the sophisticated Protestant and the humanists are quite aware that there is no room for heaven, nor for eternity in their universe. Their thoroughly liberal sensibility again looks not to a transcendent, but to an inanimate source for its ethical doctrine, and their agile intelligence is even capable of turning this into a positive apology. It is, in this view, both realism and quote, courage to live without hope of eternal joy, nor fear of eternal pain. To one endowed with a liberal view of things, it is not necessary to believe in heaven or hell to lead a quote, good life in this world. Such is the total blindness of the liberal mentality to the meaning of death. If there is no immortality, the liberal believes one can still lead a civilized life. Quote, if there is no immortality, is the far profounding logic of Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's novel. Karamazov, right? Okay, quote, all things are lawful. Humanist stoicism is possible with certain individuals for a certain time. Until that is, the full implications of the denial of immortality strike home. The liberal lives in a fool's paradise, which must collapse before the truth of things. If death is, as the liberal and nihilist both believe, the extinction of the individual, then this world and everything in it, love, goodness, sanctity, everything, are as nothing. Nothing man can do is of any ultimate consequence, and the full horror of life is hidden for man only to be the strength of their will to deceive themselves. And, quote, all things are lawful. No otherworldly hope or fear restrains men from monstrous experiments and suicidal dreams. Nietzsche's words are the truth and prophecy of the new world that results from this view. Of all that which we formerly held to be true, not one is to be credited. Everything which was formerly disdained as unholy, forbidden, contemptible, and fatal, all these flowers now bloom on the most charming paths of truth. Wow. The blindness of the liberal is a direct antecedent. 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 Nihilism. I'm not saying that. And more specifically, a Bolshevist. Morality for the letter is only consistent and systematic application of liberal unbelief. It is the supreme irony of the liberal view that is precisely even its deepest intent have been realized in the world, and all men have been, quote, liberated from the yoke of transcendent standards. When even the pretense of belief in the other world shall have vanished, it is precisely then that as life as the liberal knows or desires it shall have been impossible. For the, quote, new man, that disbelief produces only see in liberalism itself the last of, quote, illusions which liberalism wished to dispel. Okay, so where are we at? No, we're an hour and 10 minutes in. Absolutely. What's up, machine? Absolutely. Definitely, brother. Okay. So I'm going to finish this chapter. I'm gonna wrap it up for now, and I will be returning with, this furtherance on nihilism being the root of the revolution of the modern age. So, in the Christian order, politics, too, is founded upon absolute truth. We've already seen in the preceding chapter that the principal providential form of government took in union with Christian truth was the Orthodox Christian Empire, wherein sovereignty was vested in a monarch, and authority proceeded from him downwards through a hierarchical social structure. We shall see in the next chapter, on the other hand, how a politics that rejects Christian truth must acknowledge, quote, the people as sovereign, and understand authority as proceeding from below upwards in a formally, quote, egalitarian society. It is clear that one is the perfect inversion of the other, for they are opposed in their concessions both of the source and the end of the government. Orthodox Christian monarchy is government divinely established and directed ultimately to the other world. Government with the teaching of Christian truth and the salvation of souls as its profoundest purpose. Profoundest purpose. Nihilist rule, whose most fitting name, as we shall see, is anarchy, is government established by men and directed solely to this world, government which has no higher aim than earthly happiness. The liberal view of government, as one might suspect, is an attempt at compromise between these two irreconcilable ideas. In the 19th century, this compromise took the form of, quote, constitutional monarchies, an attempt again to wed an old form to a new content. Today, the chief representatives of the liberal idea are the, quote, republics and, quote, democracies of Western Europe and America, most of which preserve a rather precarious balance between the forces of authority and revolution, or professing to believe in both. It is, of course, irresponsible to believe in both with equal sincerity and fervor, and in fact, no one has ever done so. Constitutional monarchs like Louis Felipe thought to do so by professing to rule by the grace of God and the will of the people, a formula whose two terms annul each other rather, a fact as equally evident to the Antichrist as to the monarchist. Now, a government is secure insofar as it has God for its foundation and his will for its guide, but this surely is not a description of liberal government. It is in the liberal view the people who rule and not God. God himself is a constitutional monarch whose authority has been totally delegated to the people and whose function is entirely ceremonial. The liberal believes in God with the same rhetorical fervor with which he believes in heaven. The government erected upon such a faith is very little different, in principle, from a government erected upon total disbelief, and whatever its present residue of stability, it is clearly pointed in the direction of anarchy. A government must rule by the grace of God, or by the will of the people, or it must believe in the authority or the revolution. On these issues, compromise is possible only in semblance, and only for a time. The revolution, like the disbelief which is already accompanied it, cannot be stopped halfway. It is a force that, once awakened, will not rest until its end in a totalitarian kingdom of this world. The history of the last 2 centuries has proved nothing if not this: to appease the revolution and offer its concessions, as liberals have always done, thereby showing that they have no truth with which to oppose it, is perhaps to postpone, but not to prevent, the attainment of its end, and to oppose the radical revolution with a revolution of one's own, whether to be, quote, conservative, quote, nonviolent, or, quote, spiritual. It is not merely to reveal ignorance of the full scope of the nature of revolution of our time, but to concede as well to the first principle of that revolution, that the old truth is no longer true and a new truth must take its place. Our next chapter will develop this point by defining more clearly the goal of the revolution. In the liberal worldview, therefore, in its theology, its ethics, its politics, and in other areas we have not examined as well, truth has been weakened, softened, compromised. In all realms, truth was once absolute, has become less than certain. It is not entirely, quote, relative, if not entirely relative. Now, it is possible that this, in fact, amounts to a definition of liberal enterprise: to preserve for a time the fruits of a system and truth of which one is uncertain or skeptical. But one can build nothing positive upon such uncertainty, nor upon the attempt to make it intellectually respectable in the various relativistic doctrines we have already examined. There is and can be no philosophical apology for liberalism. Its apologies, when not simply rhetorical, are emotional and pragmatic. But the most striking fact about the liberal, to any relatively unbiased observer, is not so much the inadequacy of his doctrine as his own seeming oblivion to this inadequacy. This fact, which is understandably irritating to well meaning critics of liberalism, has only one possible explanation. The liberal is undisturbed even by fundamental deficiencies and contradictions in his own philosophy, because his primary interest is elsewhere. If he is not concerned to found the political and social order upon divine truth, if he is indifferent to the reality of heaven and hell, if he conceives of God as a mere idea of a vague and personal power, it is because he is more immediately interested in worldly ends, and because everything else is vague or abstract to him. The liberal may be interested in culture and learning and business, or merely in comfort, but in every one of his pursuits, the dimension of the absolute is simply absent. He is unable or unwilling to think in terms of ends and ultimate things. The thirst for absolute truth has vanished, has been swallowed up in worldliness. In the liberal universe, of course, truth, which is to say, learning, is quite compatible with worldliness. But there is no more to truth than learning. Quote, every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. End quote. No one has rightly sought the truth who has not encountered at the end of the search whether to accept or reject him. Our Lord Jesus Christ, quote, the way, the truth, and the life. Truth stands against the world and is a reproach to all worldliness. The liberal who thinks his universe secure against this truth is the, quote, rich man of the parable, overburdened by this worldly interest and ideas, unwilling to give them up for the humility, poverty, and lowliness that are marks of genuine seekers of truth. Nietzsche has given a second definition of nihilism, or rather a commentary on the definition. Quote, there is no truth, and that is, quote, there is no answer to the question, why? Nihilism must means that the ultimate questions have no answers. That is to say, no positive answers. And the nihilist is he who attempts to implicit no the universe supposedly gives as its answer to these questions. But there are two ways of accepting this answer. There's the extreme path wherein it is made explicit and amplified in the programs of revolution and destruction. This is the nihilism properly so called active nihilism. For in Nietzsche's world, quote, nihilism is not only the belief that everything deserves to perish, but only actually puts one's shoulder to the plow one destroys. But there's also a quote moderate path, which is that of the passive or implicit nihilism we have been examining here. The nihilism of the liberal, the humanist, the agnostic, who agrees that, quote, there is no truth, no longer asks the ultimate questions. Active nihilist presupposes this nihilism of skepticism and disbelief. The totalitarian nihilist regimes of this century have undertaken an integral part of their programs. The ruthless, quote, re education of their people, few subjected to this process for any length of time have entirely escaped its influence in a landscape where all its nightmare, one sense of reality and truth inevitably suffers. A subtler uh, quote, re education, quite humane in its means, but nonetheless nihilist in its consequences, have been practiced for some time in the free world, and nowhere persistently or effectively than in the intellectual center, the academic world. Here, external coercion is replaced by internal persuasion. A deadly skepticism reigns behind the remains of a Christian heritage in which few believe and even fewer with deep conviction. The profound responsibility the scholar once possessed, the communication of truth, has been reneged, and all the pretended, quote, humility that seeks to conceal this fact behind sophisticated chatter on the, quote, the limits of human knowledge is but another mask of the nihilism and liberal academian shares with the extremists of our day. Youth that, until it is re educated in the academic environment, still thirsts for truth, is taught instead of truth the, quote, history of ideas, or its interest is diverted into, quote, comparative studies, and the all pervading relativism and skepticism inoculated in these studies is sufficient to kill in almost all the natural thirst for truth. The academic world, and these words are neither lightly nor easily spoken, has become today in large part a source of corruption. It is corrupting to hear or read the words of men who did not believe in truth. It is yet more corrupting to receive in place of truth more learning and scholarship, which, if they are presented as ends in themselves, are no more than parodies of the truth they were meant to serve, no more than a facade behind which there is no substance. It is tragically corrupting even to be exposed to the primary virtue still left. To the academic world, the integrity of the best of its representatives, if there is integrity, serves not the truth, but skeptical scholarship, and so seduces men all the more effectively to the gospel of uh, subjectism and unbelief. This scholarship conceals. It is corrupting, finally, simply to live and work in an atmosphere totally permeated by a false conception of truth, wherein Christian truth is seen as an irrelevant to the central academic concerns, wherein even those who still believe this truth can only sporadically make their voices heard about the skepticism promoted by the academic system. The evil, of course, lies primarily in the system itself, which is founded upon untruth. and only incidentally in the many professors whom this system permits encourages to preach it. The liberal, the worldly man is the man who has lost his faith, and the loss of perfect faith is the beginning of the end of the order erected upon that faith. Those who seek to preserve the prestige of truth without believing in it offer the most potent weapon of all their enemies. A merely metaphorical faith is suicidal. The radical attacks the liberal doctrine at every point, and the veiled rhetoric ain't no protection against the strong thrust of his sharp blade. The liberal, under this precedent attack, gives way on point after point, forced to admit that the truth of the changes against him without being able to counter this negative, critical truth with any positive truth of its own, until after a long and usual gradual transition of a sudden he wakens to discover that the old order, the undefeated and seemingly indefensible, has been overthrown, and that a mere more, quote, realistic and more brutal truth has taken the field. Liberalism is the first stage of the nihilist dialectic, both because its own faith is empty, because this emptiness calls it into being as yet more nihilistic reaction, a reaction that ironically proclaims even more loudly than liberalism its love of truth, while carrying mankind one step further on the path of error. This reaction is the second stage of the nihilistic dialectic, realism. Okay, so I'm going to end here. I appreciate everybody that stopped by tonight. Um, Father Joseph's going live in 5 minutes. So, yeah. Thanks, guys. I'm on Team Warfare, and I'll be back. We're going to do the next video I'm going to do on Man Against God. I got a magazine called Epiphany, and it's about this strong delusion of the Marxist faith. I'll begin with that, and then I'll go back to this chapter on realism, and that should be in about 2 days. And then after that, I'm going to return to, you know, the last subject I was doing. It's I don't know. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. I appreciate you guys. Later.